One of the big things I do particularly remember during the Brexit referendum was the idea that we could become Singapore on the Thames. Now, this was the idea by the Brexiteers that we could somehow recreate what Singapore had done, becoming like a gateway to China and the rest of the world through its very unique geographical position where it is. Um, I think the vast majority of the world's trade does flow directly past Singapore or through Singapore, but Singapore itself massively nationalized its industries. You do not hear Brexiteers talking about that. And this is where the whole Singapore on the Thames really fell down. But this was a big dream of many of the Brexiteers. Patrick Minford being the biggest speaker and talker about, Singapore on the Thames. But as we've said before, the only problem was that, well, Minford was, well, told a bit too much of the truth. So the Brexit economist, as he was cast as, was, like I say, very quickly wheeled back into a corner in the hopes that no one would pay attention to him. But also Daniel Hannan himself as well would say this phrase time and time again, not only in some speeches that he would use during the Brexit referendum campaign, but of course, infamously now, at one point, Brexit the movie. And maybe at some point we should do some sort of watch party of like Brexit the movie, which might be quite fun. I know that there is an entire website dedicated just going through minute by minute of like all the inaccuracies and all the missed things that Brexit the movie has said. So that might be fun maybe at some point to do in the future. I don't know. We'll see. But yeah, today we're going over this because we have someone pining the idea that the Brexit dream of Singapore on the Thames is now dead and gone. That this idea that we can bring this back, that we can recreate this idea, it's done. It's over, guys. Just don't talk about it anymore because it's quite embarrassing. So we're gonna go over that. But before we do go over this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. Of course, there are links down below to my Patreon page, the one donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, there's the Pony Club down below as well. So let's go over onto this. This comes from the Telegraph with how the Brexit dream of Singapore on the Thames was lost. So the dream of Singapore on the Thames, a low-tax, small state, lightly regulated economy that was freed from the shackles of the European institution, could thrive anew on the world stage. And nearly 8 years after the 2016 referendum, the reality of it is a still deeply divided nation heading, according to new analysis by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, not to some kind of low-tax, super competitive economic nirvana, but the highest tax burden since the Second World War. And with some state institutions now 3 to 4% points bigger as a share of national income than it was before the vote for Brexit. Well, a lot of that, and the state has had to increase because it has now had to take on more responsibilities. This was one of the biggest talking points you heard about Singapore on the Thames. Smaller state. Well, no, you're like, hold on. If we leave the European Institute in these institutions, we then have to replicate these. We have to re-replicate these bodies, make sure there are people watching this kind of stuff. The state isn't going to get smaller because of Brexit. It's going to have to get bigger because we now have to have these types of institutions. We have to make sure that different departments are watching these different things that we used to sort of, all pay into the pot for when we had them. And the EU and the EU used to sort of do that. That's not the case anymore. But again, the logic of Singapore on the Thames, as they say. What is more is the IFS says that there is almost nothing that the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt can do to avoid these outcomes. Britain is already burgeoning debt, has Hunt and any Labour successor stitched up like a kipper with no way out. Wherever you look, there is a deep sense of malaise, and it is indeed Indeed, a very hard to call a time when people were more pessimistic about the future than they are now. The two things may not be entirely connected, but being out on our own has now failed to improve the mood. Nothing seems to work. There are now more longer waiting lists for almost every public service. There is not enough housing to go around. And we've had, and it's such a loss for solutions, our public discourse has degenerated um, into the bile of culture wars and irrelevance. Well, who's responsible for these culture wars? It's the Tories. They're the ones who want to start these culture wars because they want to sort of bring them over from Europe. So, what on earth happened? Why has the spirit of national renewal that Brexit was meant to give rise to fallen to such a shortfully woes? Well, according to Liz Truss, the former Prime Minister, it is all down to the deep state. And to be honest, anything Liz Truss says here about the deep state, any of these stuff, just absolute pure conspiracy theories. They're looking for someone else to blame for their own faults. We've talked about this many times before. They are free market fundamentalists. They believe their ideology is the true and correct way, and that if it isn't working, it's not the ideology. They shouldn't rethink their ideas. They shouldn't rethink their policies. It's something else because our ideology is the correct and true one. So, according to Liz Truss, the Prime Minister, or the former Prime Minister, it is all down to the deep state, a very suffocating conspiracy theory of bureaucrats and quangos that are determined to thwart the noble ambitions of elected politicians such as herself. Truss, by the way, campaigned for Remain, but then there is no zeal quite like a convert. Very good to bring up there. There may also be some again, there may be some element. Again, I think you have to put some element of truth. I think that doing a lot of heavy lifting in those quotes around there. In what she says about the Whitehall obstinacy and the shortcomings of the non-elected technocrats. But her take on events is essentially just a lot of paranoid nonsense. At least I'm glad he is calling that out, calling straight out of the populist playbook, where the imaginary enemy within is created to hate the hate plank to try and channel the discontent of voters. It was up to Brexit political cheerleaders to make something out of Britain's decision to leave the European Union, whatever obstacles, but they failed. They overpromised and underdelivered, and the presiding government is now about to reap the whirlwind. Holy moly, someone in the Telegraph being honest, because this is what we've said right from the beginning. The Brexiteers promised so much, and a lot of the stuff they knew they couldn't deliver, they knew what they were able to do, and they've hugely underdelivered on this. So, holy moly, good on the Telegraph for once, calling that out. This was not because the bureaucrats betrayed them or even a more credible excuse of the pandemic. It was because of the vision of Singapore on the Thames was always a fantasy. They would never be capable of uniting the nation behind it. Everyone wants lower taxes, but on the whole, they also want top drawer public services, a credible military, a free at point use of national health service, and the triple lock state pensions. Yeah, exactly. This is the problem. Even conservatives find themselves and would vote very high for. Oh, we want low taxes, but actually, we don't want to lose like our high quality, public services. Well, if you want good public services, you've got to pay for them through taxes. And I've said I think the era of us going to sort of low tax is a dream. It's a fantasy at this point. So when Liz Truss attempted to try and square the circle with unfunded tax cuts while at the same time launching an unprecedented package of big state energy subsidies, it presumably ended in tears. She was right about planning reform, right about some of the other building blocks that needed to create a functioning, enterprising economy. But you cannot defy gravity. Her plans were never going to pass muster with the markets, and it's odd that she seeks to blame the Office for Budget Responsibility for the critics that for the cries that erupted because she had in fact dispensed with its services. Markets then drew the obvious conclusion that if the OBR would never have weathered her fiscal incompetence. As for the Bank of England, It also singled out by Truss for blame last week at America's Conservative Political Action Conference. The economy would have been in even deeper mire had it not acted to support the gilt market. And that's something else I keep on bringing up time and time again, that if they had not stepped in, there were pensions companies about an hour away from going bankrupt. Things could have been infinitely worse. Things are bad now, don't get me wrong, but things could have been so much more worse if the Bank of England had not stepped in and they had not had the power to step in. Because this is what people like Liz Truss and all the Conservatives talking about now, taking that power away from the Bank of England so that they could make it. Do you think Liz Truss would have made that decision to support the gilts market and save the pensions industries? No. She would have said her plan is acting well. You're just going to have faith to support it. So things could have been infinitely worse, so much worse, if Truss had had the power on that front. So, in all, Truss's premiership was one of the most humiliating episodes in British economic history since the mid-1970s, when the government was forced to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund for an emergency bailout. Lots of people tried to stop her, but she insisted on putting her hand in the fire. There are few politicians wiser, the more insightful than Tharman Shanmugaratnam, that's how you say it, who once told me that the aspiration of Singapore on the Thames was a ludicrous trope that was quite unsuited to the mature, advanced economy such as Britain. And of course, there was no comparison between the two. You could not make one like the other, he opined. Quite so, and he should know, as he has since recently become the president of the Southeastern Asian city-state. None of us will, of course, prevent old wounds from reopening once Labour is back in power later this year. Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, has pledged to put acrimony of the divorce from Europe behind us and forge closer links with the EU. Again, yes, we should absolutely do that. That is no doubt. Labour should do that. Quite how close and conditionally might we be attached is not yet not clear. But he seems certain that the perfect sovereignty that he once envisioned by Brexit supporters will now be significantly diluted and compromised. Keir Starmer has ruled out taking Britain back into the single market and customs union, and the EU does not in any way, in any case, want perfidious Albion back. That boil has now been lanced. The other side does not want to go through that all again. All the same, Labour now would negotiate in many practices over time the amount at much to pretty much the same thing. This is partly because of the geopolitical forces that are remorselessly now pushing the UK and the EU back together. This is something we've always said. Politically, geopolitically, economically, the UK, it's going to be end up back in Europe in some way, shape, or form. It's just inevitable. And even now, with potentially Trump coming in, that would accelerate, I think, that things even more in that way. But there you go. So it continues. So as trade with the blocks now becomes more difficult, the UK will naturally gravitate towards its closest neighbors. It already is over Ukraine. Under Joe Biden, there is no chance of any comprehensive free trade deals with the US. There's no one under Donald Trump either. And under Donald Trump, there would be even less. Again, as I just said, Trump's previous use of universal tariffs on foreign imports would apply as much to Britain as the EU. Besides, the chance of Trump and Starmer seeing eye to eye on almost anything are zero. The same political mismatch would also apply to India, now widely regarded as the next China in terms of economic potential. Labour's ambivalence on Kashmir's self-determination is the readiest of red lines for India's nationalist premier of Modi. He could scarcely even be bleaker a red line than the IFS latest appraisal of Britain's tax and spend options. You can fiddle around with detail as much as you like, but the big picture is that there aren't any. 3 economic shocks in a row: the financial crisis, the pandemic, and the energy price shock, in combination with spending pressures of aging demographics and an ever more thirsty military, have now left public finances in the most ghastly of messes. Unable or unwilling to take advantage of Britain's Brexit freedoms, but denied unfettered access to the European markets, the wider economy, meanwhile, sputters alarmingly from one shock to the next, seemingly hold out below the waterline, the Singapore and the Thames. This is not. The thing is, you can't take advantage of these Brexit freedoms because that would mean deregulating in a whole host of regions and areas. And the second you start to do that, well, then our largest trading partner of our closest neighbor suddenly now becomes infinitely much harder for what? The minuscule amount of profits and possibilities that exist everywhere else. You look at the trade deals with India, well, not India, that Australia, New Zealand, less than 1%. The magnificent trade bloc we've joined, the Pacific Partnership, less than 1%. It's 0.08%. So at least this. I am now glad that there now seems to be a school of thought emerging, which is, to be honest, quite good that this is now emerging. That the idea of Singapore on the Thames is just dead in the water. It can't possibly happen. Economic conditions are just impossible for it to ever happen. That trying it, as Liz trusted, would just lead to absolute disaster. And then now we've had once again another, great pillar of Brexit in its Jenga tower being poked and pulled away at. So then how long we can continue on this fantasy? And again, I encourage Starmer and the Labour government to sort of forge closer ties because that's what we need to do. We've got a lot of bridge rebuilding to sort of do with Europe, and I think sort of doing looking things like defense pacts, especially in the light of Trump's comments about NATO, the ongoing conflict over there becoming ever more vital, that we have those defensive pacts and that Europe can have its own strategic anomaly, not have to rely on a US that is seemingly now going to oscillate between people like Joe Biden and potentially another Trump-like figure. So, yeah, we are going to be ever more closely because of, again, just the nature of the geopolitical world, just ever closer pushed more towards Europe. It's just inevitable. But we've said that before. I don't know how many times. But as always, thank you very much for watching. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.